Well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to you lovely folks joining me here nice and early over at Marble Snap Zone. Welcome back for our favourite weekly segment, our weekly tier list update. It's time to break down for you lovely folks at home what's doing well on the Marble Snap ladder right now, where you should be looking to go if you have the cards, and what decks you should be excited to play in the upcoming weeks. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to us here on the channel. It's very helpful in keeping this kind of content going, and hopefully we will see more of you in the future for that. Just press the like button while you're down there as well. It goes a long way in helping the algorithm think that we don't suck at this kind of stuff. If you have played other established card games on the market before, such as Hearthstone, you might very well know some of the proverbs of card game history. Play a card so it's in play. These proverbs usually have a common ground. Do the simple thing the game asks you to do, and then be rewarded for doing it. Up until now, Marble Snap was a game where creativity was heavily rewarded. Being able to surprise your opponent would usually lead to being able to get away with more snaps than popular decks necessarily would, and the opponent, didn't necessarily know what kind of trouble they were, going to be expected to face. I still believe this to be true at this moment in time. However, it's undeniable that as some cards, evolve and get more understood, they become metagame staples in the eyes of many, and will be the default choice you should expect when a player doesn't know how to complete their deck. Namely, Baero and Leader have appeared in almost every single archetype you could think of and contributed to his success in some way. Because of this domination, Baero and Leader have stopped being considered the best cards overall, and more the best cards to complete a deck, and then more they're being built around as foundations. People are choosing to find the best way to abuse those abilities because they expect to see them everywhere. This has led Marble Snap to become a game of who can gain priority by turn 5, where cards like Lizard, Maximus, even Sunspot, Ebony Maw shine with their ability to secure more points than the opponent and make sure you are the one with priority. Once ahead, those decks simply look to take out the likeliest cards our opponent might play, kind of like shutting the door on the game in those final turns. In those strategies, cards like Leech or Shang-Chi have emerged as powerful fight-back tools, albeit their low power contribution to your side of the table. Despite that, if they can simply take out the only thing left for the opponent to come back, they'll feel like they're the best card in the game right now. Counters have started to emerge as well in the form of decks that are fine leaving the priority to the opponent, as they figured they probably couldn't fight for it anyway. For now, these are mostly decks that are in the works and find themselves in tier 2 and 3, but show that the metagame will keep on moving. This new way of playing Marble Snap has made this tier list very difficult to make, as every archetype could now be considered a 15-card deck, really, where the last 2 or 3 inclusions can be swapped around at any time. The decision of what to play being based on what you're facing currently, and also what you might play in the future if you're fighting for control of priority, if you actively want to abuse the fact that your opponent wants it instead. As a result, the recently included potential additions part of this video and the write-up article you can find in the description box down below from the lovely DenCCG is very, very important this week, as very few decks can be considered a solid 12-card suggestion in the current environment, instead being more of a framework for 15 or 16 different cards. We actually have a very special episode of the tier list here on YouTube this week, because I am not going to be alone. I'm actually being joined by the mastermind behind the tier list himself. DenCCG is joining me to come and talk shop, bounce some ideas about the decks being featured, explain to you in more detail why they are ranked the way they are, and hopefully just alleviate some concerns about maybe some questions you had about the tier list when you saw it go up on the site or on Twitter. Just before we get into that, I do have to thank some sources that we used to create this tier list. Of course, marblesnap.pro, now the home of our dedicated PC Windows-based tracker that is slowly but surely becoming more of a foundation of our tier list. The data provided about this, including cube averages, win rates, deck popularity, deck play rates, all kinds of stuff, even replay features are available in the tracker now alongside all of this data, which is helping us massively to inform this piece of content moving forward. Of course, SnapFan and their community Discord server still doing fantastic work and offering some data for us to work with as well. The SnapDecks team over on Twitter regularly retweeting and sharing successful people and their successful decks. Marble Snap IO, and of course all the players who offer their insight and their time to come and chat with us about all things tier list, about all things Marble Snap, to help us in figuring out what it is that we want to do. So, before Den joins me, I'm going to break down the tier list for you. If all you're looking for is the breakdown, the article is available for you in the description box down below, and it will be available on screen for you now. There you go, the entire tier list in its entirety. It's a big one this week. There are many decks on here, including several new, several moving up, and a couple even moving down over the course of a game. As a result, things that are in tier 4 or the budget options that we include in this article every week, we're not talking about them in the video today because it's already going to be well over an hour by the time that we finish the video in length, and we don't want to do that to you. So if you're looking for any of the tier 4 choices, you want more details about those, you can go give them a click in the description box down below in the article. Go check them out, and much the same for the budget decks. However, this week, let's take a look at Tier 3 by itself. To start with, a few mover-uppers and a few new faces in Tier 3 this week. Only a small handful of decks, though. Bounce Thanos making its way up. Deck being refined, exceptionally complicated, but having a good week all around. Discard Lockjaw, the lesser of the two discard decks right now. Its attempts to innovate kind of not really working, finding itself in Tier 3 as well. Lockjaw On Reveal, however, making a resurgence as the primary way of playing on reveal strategies over Wong this week, finding itself in tier number 3, and this brand new inclusion of Cerebro 2 making a tier 3 appearance and looking to continue to climb in this world currently. Tier 2, however, is easily the chunkiest tier of the week this time around. There is like 9 decks here, if I remember correctly, that can be considered tier 2 choices in the current metagame. You've got some well-known established archetypes and a few new faces as well. We'll start with the new. The 2 decks you see at the top of this list here, very similar in premise. The Good Cards Devil Dinosaur deck and the Shuri Pile mid-range deck. We'll be covering them together in the video and explaining to you why they're so similar and what you should be looking as key differences between those 2 decks. A more traditional controlling version of Sera Miracle makes a return to tier number 2 this time around. Turns out when everyone's fighting for priority and you don't care about it, you can build to accentuate on that fact. Electro Ramp makes an appearance as a tier 2 archetype this week, continuing to evolve and benefit from the metagame being all about points. Zero, fantastic in the face of Leech and a few other tools as well. Taskmaster, good into leader turns on the final turn of the game. Many other play patterns there to enjoy, making a decent showing this week. Patriot, solid deck, always a solid deck, king of consistency, finds itself in tier 2 once again. Galactus Knull, the wallet deck of the format, if you're looking to enjoy that destroy play pattern, firmly in tier 2 and definitely an option you can consider if you enjoy what it has to offer and happen to have access to those cards. Hela Discard, now the preferred discard deck of choice when the game is all about final turn stats. And of course, Ongoing Destroyer, a fan favourite, finding itself at the bottom of tier 2 this week. Last but not least, we have our 3 tier 1 decks that we consider to be the best decks in the game currently. Negative Surfer, Sera Miracle Surfer, 2 decks that many people obviously understand are extremely powerful. Continue to see tons of play, even though people are actively trying to hate them out. Definitely the decks to keep your eyes on still as the most powerful thing you can be doing in Marvel Snap if left uninterrupted. The other choice very much falls into a similar vein here. She-Hulk Baero, a deck many people are concerned about seeing in tier 1. Not necessarily sure that it's playable in a world of Leech and Leader, but Den has some fantastic rationale behind that and explains the thought process as to why it's still doing something so powerful that it is worth considering as a tier 1 deck. With all that said, I'm going to cut over to me and Den in the past now as we start talking you through every single deck in this tier list, and hopefully you can learn a little bit more about it. Okay folks, and welcome on into a very special version of this week's tier list. Very happy to say that I'm here with the man, the brain behind the tier list itself. Please join me in welcoming DenCCG. Den, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm actually really happy that we finally managed to find time to be both on this video, because I enjoy doing this a ton and I actually enjoy this video a lot. So like it's actually a great opportunity for me.
I'm very happy to be able to finally get to do it with you. Something we've wanted to do for a little while, but the logistics don't always line up. So we talked briefly in the intro a little bit about how we've kind of broken things down in the tier list. We kind of explained in some detail why the leader Lich situation kind of is the way that it is and why we're breaking it down in the metagame the way that we are. And kind of just emphasizing that big point of yours that at the moment priority seems to be king, and as a result, like cards like Leech and Shang-Chi have kind of emerged as powerful tools to go about counteracting that kind of proactive play pan. How are you feeling about the metagame in Marvel Snap right now?
I think Marvel Snap is still one of the most dynamic games in terms of like how it moves quite fast. Like for example, like I play Hearthstone a ton as well, and I feel like once Hearthstone reach a point where people are comfortable with something, it tends to really like be stale. I don't think we've reached that point in Marvel Snap. Like we have identified cards that are probably way too strong and are kind of like vampirizing the metagame a little, but things still move. I mean, we managed to get Leech back in the game as a metagame card. Like 2 weeks ago, it was considered like a bottom 5 card, all cards considered. So I feel like there's still things to explore. There's still things to do, but we might get closer to that like stale point where we actually need developers to come in and change things.
I think that's perfectly fair to say, and I think as you mentioned before, as a result, the recently kind of included part of this tier list with potential additions this week is like arguably more important than ever because of that kind of kingpin card, linchpin card mentality. As very few decks right now can be like considered a solid 12 card deck that is only those 12 and nothing else with the current suggestions. So we're going to take this from the top. We're going to walk through the decks that are on this tier list from tier 1 all the way down to tier 3. So it's like 15 decks this week. Plenty of things to talk about. So if folks are looking for tier 4 or budget options, they are available in the article. Go give it a click for me in the description box down below. But I can't keep Den here for that long. We'll be here all day if we talk about them all. So starting at the very, very top, tier 1, current quote-unquote best deck, Negative Surfer, kind of a deck that we kind of highlighted in part last week. Definitely one of the best homes for Bast, now that it's a card that's kind of finding its feet in the game. In a world where kind of like everyone is trying to do the overall best thing and kind of control what their opponent is doing, Mr. Negative's actually a bit of an exception to that. Thanks to its synergistic nature and kind of difficult to predict final turns, it can be better into, cards like Aero and Leader than some other decks. Most of the time, a perfect game for this deck can arguably ignore everything the opponent is trying to do. Why do you think that makes Negative powerful right now?
Well, I think it's not as much negative. It's really like Silver Surfer. And I think currently, a card that is able to impact the game wherever it lands because of Aero and not give points to your opponent because of Leader is an incredible card. Like, we talked about, like, we will talk about Leech and that kind of cards that are counters. Silver Surfer just feels like a card that's like, yeah, just throw anything you want at me. Apart from Cosmo canceling it, or Leech, if you keep it in your hand for too long, you get punished for it. It feels like the deck can, a lot of the time, just forget about the super popular cards that are Aero and Leader and still be really, really close to playing a perfect game. And currently, like, it's such luxury to be able to play that way.
Yeah, sounds super promising, and Negative's personally an archetype I love. I've played quite a lot of it myself, lucky enough to have access to Bast. But if people are picking this deck up for the first time and looking to explore it themselves, what are some of the big play patterns they should be looking for?
I think the first thing, compared to the past with this deck, is don't be greedy. Like, usually Mr. Negative, you want to play Negative on 4-3 if you have Psylocke and actually have, like, the nutty hand. But then you would actually hide as much information as possible until turn 6. Because there's Leech and Leader in the game right now, a lot of times you're fine just throwing your cards on 5, and you're going to have a worse 6, but you're also going to make the popular tech cards much less effective against you. So I think right now, the best thing would be like turn 5, especially like if you have your Surfer negatived or something like this, don't be greedy with it. Let's just take the points and kind of play on curve. And in the end, like, if your 6 is worse, their 6 is likely going to be worse as well. So it just equalizes.
Yeah, sounds very promising. I think that's something enough people don't necessarily consider about the play patterns of a card like Leader right now, is that for the most part, it's always going to be coming down on turn 6 and will actively punish you for holding on to those big point turns until that final turn, something we're all very used to in Marvel Snap because we're rewarded quite heavily for saving our points until the final turn. There is definitely some counterplay in pushing it a bit earlier. This deck is kind of a bit awkward when it comes to potential additions, honestly. There's not a lot of space for tech cards in here. It's very tight based on what's going on. Rogue is kind of the exception, tends to be, fits the bill of a good card with Mr. Negative, good with Silver Surfer, and a good like anti-tech card for things like Wong or Sera that might be problematic. But of course, the question we always get with a deck like this is, what can I do if I don't have Bast? So if any of our players don't have the Series 5 card, what should they be looking to play instead?
I guess the easy fix, probably if you don't have Bast, you have to remove Adam Warlock as well, because just Adam Warlock has come into the game because Bast on 1, Adam Warlock on 2 is nutty, especially in a deck that if possible, you want to draw the whole deck. So if you don't have Bast, I would recommend changing Adam Warlock as well. And I guess cards that would make sense are the usual suspects with negative. Look for the lowest power possible and cards that are allowing you to scale, because Bast and Adam Warlock are like scaling cards in the deck. They're not payoffs at the end of the game. So Angela, Bishop is quite okay. Mojo has been seen in the deck because we have Brood, so it's quite easy to activate Mojo. These kind of cards, like cards that you can slam in the early game that don't really punish you for keeping them in your hand. And at worst, even if they get touched by Mr. Negative, you still get a little bit of value out of it.
Yeah, sounds super promising. Definitely a top contender at the moment. Nice to see people finding a way to break symmetry with play patterns against a deck that includes a copy of Leader. So, Negative Surfer, looking strong. Unsurprisingly, more Surfer decks kind of coming next. That card, just a fantastic reason to buy a Battle Pass. We're taking a look at Seracle Surfer this time around. While Leader, of course, being very popular, has definitely instilled some doubts about how good these like turn 6 decks are. We think Sera's kind of fine against Leader once you understand how that card works and start playing your best cards on locations that your opponent has already kind of filled up over the course of a game. There are also some really fun little plays you can pull to counter it, such as, Silver Surfer and then your Cosmo in the same location if you're revealing first. We've even seen some people trying out cards like Carnage in lists like this to really mess up that final turn and copy a Carnage over with Leader. This deck hasn't changed that much over the last week, and it's still just very, very good at what it does. Non-committal cards in the early game, Sera on 5, tons of power on kind of turn 5 and turn 6. Do we expect this one to stay where it is in the metagame, or is this kind of just a sign of the times?
It is really good because just like Mr. Negative, Sera doesn't really care where it ends up. Like you aero Sera, like cool, still Sera is in play. I'm quite happy about it. That's what the deck wants to do. And we have cards that are very low power, super high synergy for Leader. The big problem for this deck is Leech. Like, getting Leeched on 5 is a big problem. So, I don't think for now, Leech is popular enough to take the deck out of the game. But if you're starting to see more Leeches, you probably want to, get out of this one.
Makes a lot of sense. All kinds of sweet play patterns with this deck. I know you're also a really big fan of playing Goose in this list, much like myself, to kind of lock off a location where you don't intend on playing Sera. You can stick some 3-cost cards behind it and get those stats on there later with Silver Surfer. We've definitely had some people toying around with Bast and Warlock in this list as well, trying to play that Spiral game over something like Nova and Killmonger. But I know some people have been toying around with a card like Domino in this deck. Why do we want a card like Domino, maybe?
Basically, most of the time, if you're going to build this deck without Domino, the basic would be like a 1 and double 2, which is, I guess, like statistically optimized to make sure we have something. And Domino just says, like, screw the stats. I'm here on 2. Don't worry about it. Just fill your deck with 3 costs. So, arguably, Domino, just allows you to play 1 more 3 cost in your deck. And the best thing with the deck is Silver Surfer. So, maybe you just want as many 3 costs as possible. Make it a little bit more as a combo deck. And also, people are playing Magic, Wong. And usually, Domino is the way to get that extra slot available so you can get that card in the deck.
Makes a lot of sense. I know a lot of people obviously ask us with decks like this as well, what do I do if I'm missing a card like Maximus? Maximus is really hard to replace, I think, unfortunately. It's just 7 is such a large number. But in the world that you are missing it, I guess our best recommendation at the moment is maybe a card like Polaris. Still really good stats, very much like Juggernaut, gives you some location denial ability, and again, there's another 3-cost card for Silver Surfer, so that's probably where we'd start on that one.
There's Wolfsbane, that can be a 7, but the problem with Wolfsbane is that when he gets leeched, it's an honorable card. Well, Maximus and Polaris actually don't care about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
They're a little bit more of like insurance about how you're gonna math out your points, while like in the negative deck, you have no choice. You have to go full on synergy. With Sera, you can actually play like just good cards and be less vulnerable to like removing your abilities.
Makes a lot of sense. If you're looking for the deck that has the throne right now, but is less synergistic and more about just playing good cards, this seems like a really good place to start with the Seracle Surfer list. We're moving on to our other Tier 1 choice of this week. This one a bit contentious, it would appear. She-Hulk Baero, once kind of one of the kingpins of the game, still is, in our opinion, and kind of very much based around that iconic synergy at this point of Wave alongside She-Hulk and Death to kind of cheat these big cards into play on the final turn of the game, usually alongside a card like Aero or Leader to guarantee that your opponent has basically next to no counterplay in those spots. This is still the best deck in the game for a lot of people, but it has suffered at the hands right now of Leech these past few days, like negating Leader, but also your end game in She-Hulk and Death. So if that's the case, then why aren't we dropping this deck? Why is it still so good?
The big reason is that people, one, already started to adapt, and we'll talk about it. Tier 2 is a ton of decks that are really good against Leech, because they're just good card decks. Like, negate me, you paid 5 energy, develop up 3, I'm just gonna slam a 12, a 15 or something like that. And Baero tends to do really good against those decks, so it kind of balances out. And the other thing, and we already talked about it in the negative deck, is the deck can adapt. Yes, Baero just wants to insta-retreat if you play the classic game plan of just hoarding your resources and trying to do everything on 6. But I tried the deck against a few leeches, and sometimes I just go like Wave on turn 3, Death on turn 4, go ahead, leech me.
Okay.
Like, it might be stupid, and it's obviously weaker than the normal like Death plus Leader plus She-Hulk on turn 6, but this is why this is such a good deck. This is not a deck that just has one play pattern, and when it works out, it's good, and when it doesn't, it's bad. It's like, this is a deck that's been played, like, I think it first emerged, like, August?
Something like that, yeah.
So, like, it's super resilient. This deck has been in the metagame for, like, almost 6 months. So, 4 months, my bad. I can't count.
Some amount of time.
Yeah, a lot of time. Like, so people know how to adapt with the deck, know how to create play patterns, and that makes the deck much more resilient than a deck that emerged like last month, for example.
For sure. And I think in a similar vein, some people have expressed concerns about this deck as well, with the arrival of Knull. Obviously, Knull being a bit scary for a deck like this, that it's actively destroying so much of its own stuff. However, at the moment, we're not massively worried about that ourselves. Knull is only kind of seeing play in Galactus, and that deck, in general, not seeing a ton of play just because it requires 2 Series 5 cards that not everyone has. And we obviously already have Death in our deck to kind of benefit from their game plan naturally anyway. The play patterns of this deck haven't changed that much, barring what we kind of mentioned earlier on about sometimes taking your early wave on turn 3 into Death on turn 4 if you suspect you're going to get leeched or leadered. But there's definitely an interesting omission from the list this week. No Nova, Den. What's the thought process there?
The thought process behind it is that the more I played the deck, and the more I realized Nova was only like buffing 2-3 cards max, and so I was like, that's not enough points. If I'm just going to play to destroy stuff, I'd rather destroy Hood and actually have Demon available for later, especially against like Leech. Demon is just really good. 1 mana, 6 power, like it helps a ton. So I tried it a little bit and actually decided to put Hood back in the deck. But basically, like, there are 3 slots and 4 1-drops, and you can't really go wrong with playing any of them. And I actually even tried to cut Bucky Barnes from the deck and play all 4 1 cost. Like, this is where the deck is a little flexible, and to be honest, I haven't found like a definitive answer. This is the best way to do it. I feel like just see what you like and the way you like to play the deck, and maybe like what annoys you the most between like what your opponent can do, and just pick 3 out of 4, and you're probably gonna be good with it.
Makes a whole lot of sense. I personally love seeing Squirrel Girl back in this deck because I'm very guilty of wanting to do everything on the final 10 of the game. I want to do the leader plus She-Hulk plus Death, and obviously she enables that against matchups where leader and Leech aren't a problem. So nice to kind of see this deck still thriving. Nice to see it kind of adapting its play patterns to the current metagame and in general putting up enough of a fight to remain a tier 1 deck for us this week. However, our tier 2, kind of like you briefly alluded to, is maybe a little bit more exciting for people that are looking for ways to counter the upcoming metagame currently. We're starting with the lovingly named Good Cards Devil Dinosaur deck. Very descriptive deck name. What exactly are we looking at here?
So this is, and the next one as well, these are the decks that represent the current metagame and just embody that priority is so good. I don't care about synergies. I'm going to play cards that have a lot of points, take priority, and win the game because of it. That's literally the whole synergy. And in a way, like, this could be named also. I could have just took, like, Dara's list, which is one of the first one that rose to a lot of popularity, where there's Leech. And yes, a lot of decks, like, a lot of people mentioned that there's no Leech in the tier list this week. Leech definitely goes in this list. It's just that Leech is a counter card, so you include Leech for a reason. Otherwise, in this deck, you usually play Devil Dinosaur as the base card, like, because it just represents what the deck wants to do. But like, it's in the write-up, like, you can definitely remove Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur from it and have your tech cards slotted in, and it's gonna work just fine.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. The basic premise of this is really simple, as you say. Just get priority early on. It's really the only thing that matters. You shouldn't be scared to play Lizard on curve, play Maximus on curve. Keep that priority while gaining information with a card like White Queen. Obviously plays very well with Devil Dinosaur in this show, and then just kind of dictate how the last 2 turns play out thanks to effects like Aero and Leader. If that plan fails or the draws just kind of like don't come together, you still have a couple other very powerful play patterns thanks to things like Moon Girl into Devil Dinosaur, or just that final turn Shang-Chi that can often be so devastating right now. This deck is very much, I guess, kind of in its infancy, but it has a clear game plan, and as you say, it's nice to see they have some tech slots available for this deck to explore things like Magneto and Leech in this style of deck. The potential additions for this deck kind of very long as a result. We're going to talk about another deck very similar to this in just a second that focuses on a synergy with Shuri instead, and we've kind of looked at Leech and Magneto already in terms of things we could play in this deck. But Scorpion, another card that kind of pops up in these shells all the time if you're a little less worried about priority and you want to be able to instead do that proactively, maybe not lose the power from Lizard, but you can take the power away from your opponent instead to ensure priority that way. You've got a card like Sunspot that can play very, very well with awkward curve hands later on, and I think the one I find most interesting is Thor. Thor is a way to suddenly have 10 power on a 3-drop, something you really can't do otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, I guess, to me, the basic duo in that kind of decks are Maximus Cosmo, but with Maximus getting more and more popular, people have started to drop Cosmo, because otherwise the opponent just plays their Maximus into Cosmo and you just get 7 points against you and don't even get cards for it. And people have started to get Thor in the deck because it's a 3-4. It's not that bad. It's obviously not crazy, but it's not that bad. And because you're playing very much an uncurved game plan where you just play 1 card a turn, you actually have slots on the board that you can just throw the hammer on, and it's not gonna impair your game plan, and you get a 10 mana Tor, 10 power Tor, my bad, that is just super strong. And with a lot of people playing Maximus, actually they help you draw the hammer.
Interesting. I hadn't even thought about that play pattern. That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, really cool to see this archetype kind of evolving and continuing to thrive and figuring out what it's all about. And I say we've come a long way if we're willing to play Maximus on curve just to make sure that we have priority. As we kind of briefly alluded to, this next deck is actually very similar in design and play pattern to the Dino deck we just talked about, but instead of utilizing Dino, we're actually kind of built around Shuri here this time around, and even using it alongside cards like Vision to have this kind of pseudo mirror breaker in these priority based matchups. If someone was looking to play this style of deck, they have access to Shuri. What are the advantages of this over the previous one?
I think this one arguably has a higher point ceiling because, I mean, Shuri into several cards in the deck is just blank stupid. I mean, it's like 14, 16, 20 kind of power. And then you also have Taskmaster in the deck. So you're just literally go into, like, it's a competition of points. Let me just slam 40 over 2 turns. Like, and otherwise, the difference, I guess, and something that I liked a lot, is that it's harder to control. Like, the first one just focuses on really good cards. And nowadays, I mean, you see Lizard on 2, you see Maximus on 3, you're like, oh yeah, it's that deck. And now you actually have like some variations of it, which can kind of catch the opponent off guard and make them have like some plays that wouldn't be optimal. For example, like you go Shuri into Vision, you have a 14, they played the basic 5-drop, which is Aero, they have an 8, you have a +6, and Aero didn't even impair you because Vision can move again.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess this is just the same deck as we've seen before, except this one would be better in the mirror. And if we consider this as the most popular deck, being good in the mirror is pretty strong.
I agree, it's a huge upside, and definitely something worth paying attention to if you have access to a card like Shuri. This build originally actually stems from one of our own writers, KM Best, sharing his list on Twitter. And his list had Scorpion, Thor, and Magneto instead of Okoye, Taskmaster, and Cosmo, which goes to show really this deck is still evolving. That's a whole 3 out of 12 cards that have changed just in a very small space of time since the archetype started being played. The key thing here, definitely making sure that you do not want to play low point cards in the second part of the game, as it's going to deny you a lot of Shuri's power. So keep that in mind if you're making adjustments to this deck and trying out a version of it for yourself.
Yeah, like for example, something you never want to do is Shuri into Leech.
That is not good.
Are really good. Yeah, both cards are really good separately. Like together, they just don't work out really well.
Yeah, I think they call that a non-bow in the business, right?
Yeah. Don't do it.
Don't do that. Okay, so up next, arguably another spin on an existing archetype, one that arguably maybe isn't quite as good as its Silver Surfer predecessor, but really cool to see it having some success. This is almost closer to the original forms of this deck with Sera Miracle, this more controlling variant, looking to kind of utilize traditional play patterns, more things like Magic and Maximus and Shang-Chi, and even Mysterio as like early play patterns. We see cards like Lizard to gain priority again. It feels like that's very much what this metagame is all about right now. Why does this version of the deck make sense in the current environment?
Because everyone wants priority, and this deck is like, alright, take it, I'll just counter you. It's all it is. It's currently you either fight for priority or have to prepare for someone that's gonna abuse it. This deck feels like one of the best at being like, alright, I have Sera, which I know will lose priority against the hero, but Sera opens like Enchantress, Shang-Chi, Killmonger, these kind of cards. So go ahead, hit me with your big boys, I'll just counter on 6 and come back. And because these cards are like counters, they have quite low points, so it's not even that bad into leader.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it's not necessarily something a lot of people are considering with the way the metagame has been evolving, that the metagame, currently snapping is quite difficult without the opponent running away, because you're very clearly behind a lot of the time into aggressive snaps from a lot of these archetypes we've talked about already. So playing a deck that can, accept falling behind is actually quite happy to, and is able to snap based on the hidden information in its hand, does definitely seem to have a lot of merit. This deck kind of thrives on being non-committal. It's super flexible. The end goal is to be able to take a lane with one of your counter effects on that final turn of the game, something like Shang-Chi, Enchantress, or Killmonger, and then thanks to effects like Sera or Magic, you can play Killmonger alongside one of those 4-cost cards, meaning you can actually challenge for like several lanes at the same time, especially if Magic has given you that extra turn.
Yeah, and still we see cards like Lizard or Maximus, because we still want priority, if possible, up until turn 5, because that's gonna allow us to play around like Cosmos or things like this to counter protect our cards. But the thing is, usually we want to lose it on turn 5. Most of the time, like Sera will lose it on turn 5, except if the opponent plays Leech. But that's kind of the reason why we want priority up until this point, because we match what the opponent does. We play Sera, they play Leech. It's not that bad because we can still try to fight for points on the last turn, because the opponent didn't develop too much on turn 5 either.
For sure. And the beauty of this deck as well is basically how flexible it can be, meaning that if you want to play something like this and you're missing, one of the less key cards, you're missing Mysterio, maybe you're missing Maximus, there's a lot of play for you to work with. Scarlet Witch is historically pretty good in builds like this of Sera. Can even do this cool little trick where you get to remove Limbo from play and end the game without your opponent being aware that's going to happen. You could try, again, a card like Polaris over something like Maximus in this deck. Very, very solid at protecting your Lizard, keeping it nice and big, or clogging up the opposing lanes. And of course, the duo, the trio that see play everywhere, things like Aero, Leader, could definitely replace Magic in this shell if you want a backup plan for when you don't draw Sera. Okay, so very, very interesting stuff. Good to see this kind of deck making a resurgence. Less resurgence, more innovation coming up next. We've kind of seen a few versions of this deck in the past. The Electro Ramp style strategy, definitely looking to be refined moving forward and kind of evolving in the face of Leader and Leech. Why are we looking to play Electro Ramp without Galactus right now?
Well, there are two reasons. Number one is because Galactus is a card that's not that easy to collect. And number two is because also Galactus isn't that easy to play. Because in an Electro build, usually because you ramp, you're going to Galactus on turn 5. It is where Aero gets played, and the opponent just plays Aero on a lane where you already have a card, and then Galactus doesn't trigger, and then you just want to stop playing Marvel Snap. So as this happened like several times, people were just like, all right, I'm gonna stop playing Galactus and I'm gonna play a lot of points, and it actually worked.
Yeah, I think so. We actually featured a deck very similar to this in Infinite Decks of the Week a few weeks ago, and I ended up picking up a version of it myself and doing a dedicated deck breakdown on the Marvel Snap Zone channel, because I had a lot of fun playing Electro Ramp. I wanted to play with the card, didn't have Galactus, had to find a way to make it work. So in a way, this is very similar to a lot of the good card decks we've already talked about. The deck simply aims to develop its preset strategy and then lock the game down with Aero and with its 6-cost powerhouses once you've already created a favourable situation. Outside of playing Electro on turn 3, the rest of the deck is kind of aimed at seizing priority, like much like we talked about a million times already. Making sure that our on reveals are safe from Cosmo and more effective overall. Ebony Maw, super interesting in this list as well. Great at just making sure you take the lead and do exactly that very, very early on, as you have several ways of protecting it and also helping assist it. Things like Claw, like Aero, Magneto, even Doctor Doom and Leader towards the top end. This is definitely a pull 3 heavy deck though, so if people are missing some cards here, what are we looking at as potential replacements?
Well, basically any card that costs 5 or 6 and that makes sense in the current metagame is playable. This one is built around the On Reveal synergy, and this is why we have Odin and that kind of cards. But you could build it with like kind of a disrupt idea, playing like Dr. Octopus and these kind of cards. So this is one of the most adaptable decks depending on what you're trying to achieve. And there are a ton of cards that work. Like Leech works because, I mean, Leech on 5 is good. Try Leech on 4.
Very good.
Captain Marvel, Vision, again, keep the flexibility, work really well with cards like Ebony Maw. Lizard, Armor, just we said we wanted priority. Just Lizard is one of the better cards for it. Armor is a solid 2-drop, which actually works against one of still the most popular decks in the game in Baero. Sandman is actually a card that is really nice because, I mean, you're going to play one card a turn. Why not push your opponent to do the exact same thing? Usually 1-for-1, you're going to win most games. And then we can have more like high roll cards. For example, like you play Jubilee and Domino in the deck. So the idea is, once again, you remove some of the low cost cards. You play Domino instead to make sure you get a 2. And then Jubilee is just here like, I'm going to pull something big on 6. In case you don't have Electro, that's kind of another game plan. I personally, I'm not a big fan of this because you draw Domino on 2, which means one less shot at drawing Electro. But it makes sense. Like, I'm trying to highlight things that make sense, not necessarily all the things that I would do personally.
Yeah.
And lastly, in the On Reveal team, there's Black Panther plus Arnim Zola that you could just play like turn 4, turn 5 after Electro. 2 lanes at plus 16. Once again, really strong with the Bonimo and that kind of stuff.
it goes to show this kind of archetype can be innovated on in so many ways. The list that I played on YouTube earlier this week contained She-Hulk alongside Wave as another thing to do when you didn't draw Electro instead, which is a very interesting way of playing the deck alongside Leech. So definitely look forward to seeing how this one evolves. People kind of figuring out what the best top end is alongside this kind of Electro Wave style acceleration. Definitely plenty of room to grow here. Hopefully people keep innovating on this one. Up next, we've got Zero. Zero, a deck that initially looked like it gained quite a lot of toys from Series 4 and Series 5 kind of coming into fruition. We saw a lot of people trying out cards like Shuri in this list, even things like Titania in this list originally. Noticeably, a lot of those not in this list so far this week. Leech kind of being praised as his savior, so Zero has found another opportunity to gain momentum in doing its traditional, very original game plan, making sure it keeps priority again with these big haymakers. Ebony Maw, Lizard, Maximus, looking like they are more important than ever and making sure you're the one with play priority. The thing is, of course, in an environment where you're looking to just play out chunks of points, Zero, while it can compete, it isn't ranked as highly as other archetypes because it suffers more from things like Aero, shifting cards around lanes and not letting you play necessarily where you want to. On the other end, however, Taskmaster is one of the best counters to Leader right now, so a real mixed bag of feelings when it comes to this deck.
Yeah, there's really, really good things. Like, for example, like when I tried this deck for a tier list, someone leeched and snapped against me. And then I looked at my hand and was like, oh, Red Skull's pretty good now. So sometimes it's just like, oh, my opponent played 3 points. I'm going to play 15 with no drawback. Sounds good. And on the other hand, sometimes the exact opposite happens. They go Leech, and you were like prepping that Taskmaster to counter Leader, and they go Leech, and you're like, all right, this is a 0 power now, and I don't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like you can look at Zero really like on both ends of the spectrum. Oh my god, this is so good into the current metagame. Or, oh my god, I never managed to get the perfect stuff because something always goes wrong eventually, which places it kind of in the middle. But definitely like a lot of fun. Honestly, like I think in the current metagame, it's one of the most like roller coaster decks because a lot of things happens and you actually react a lot to what your opponent does. And also like against decks that wouldn't play too many tech cards, when it's just a battle of let's see who gains priority and gets a lot of points, you're just like, right, I'm gonna play Maximus, Red Skull, and all the big guys and see what happens.
Totally reasonable. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue with a 30 power Red Skull after a Shuri. It's kind of hard to take a location after that. I guess one of the questions we're probably going to get the most with a deck like this, do you think it's playable in the current environment if you don't have access to Shuri?
It is really tough. I think it is playable, but I also think it is much worse because Shuri just makes it that sometimes you can literally like pass 1, 2, and 3, Shuri, Red Skull, Taskmaster, good game.
Yeah.
So the thing with Shuri is that she makes up for the bad hands. Like she enables the deck to be competitive even when you don't get the ball going early on. If you don't have Shuri, every time you're going to miss your early game, it's going to be incredibly harder to come back, and that's going to lead to more losses.
Makes a lot of sense. So, playable, folks, but obviously keep in mind you'll likely have to retreat more aggressively if that's the case. Outside of kind of that spot, though, this deck is kind of hard to adapt. It's difficult to modify. A lot of the core takes up quite a lot of space. Sunspot, a card we could look at potentially to remove from the deck if you were looking to include something else in particular. And in the past, a card like Cosmo has also seen play in this archetype when it's a powerful anti-meta tool, because obviously it plays quite well with Maximus, once again, as kind of previously noted. For the most part, though, we're looking at focusing on raw power more than adapting to our opponents. We don't really want to, care about what our opponent is up to. I have seen some versions of this deck, though, that play Sera. Is that something we should maybe be looking at?
I think if you play Sera, you just cut She-Hulk because of it, because She-Hulk kind of wants you to pass 5, and Sera, well, it's Sera. You never pass 5 when you have Sera in hand. So it's I think the two cards conflict. I've seen people just argue that it's great to have both because you can just pick the play pattern depending on your hand. But in my experience, it kind of leads to weird scenarios where you have both in hand and you're like praying that you're making the good choice based on a lot of random elements. So personally, with a deck like Zero, was just aiming at developing huge synergies that leads to a ton of points, I like just taking a clear stance. This is how my deck works. This is what I'm gonna do. See if you can beat it. Like, I don't think compared to other archetypes, this one is really good at being flexible. Or I think it's going to cost you points in the end trying to be flexible.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So if you're looking for a way to play this deck without She-Hulk, maybe Sera is your ticket. But until then, if you've got everything you need, give it a miss and try it out the way that it is. Just care about those raw stats. Zero, looking pretty good. Up next, however, Patriot. This is kind of a mainstay of Marvel Snap at this point, arguably a bit of a fan favourite. Many people picking this one up because it is a little friendlier on the Series 4, Series 5 spectrum. None of that needed to play the deck. With very little ongoing disruption currently, kind of, Enchantress and Rogue falling out of favour, Patriot is kind of developing its game plan way more routinely in the current metagame, and the deck isn't that bad when it comes to competing for just like raw points overall. Despite that, it's definitely simplified a bit. I think it's more of an on-curve deck this time. Getting your signature card leeched is obviously awful, but if you don't get Patriot leeched, you have all the upside of buffing all your cards regardless of what's going on. That does, however, mean that we're back to a Invisible Woman style build at this moment in time, where we aren't actively trying to do the magic into Onslaught, into all the ridiculous stuff version, rather making sure that we develop safely as possible. Do you think Patriot is a deck that we should be keeping an eye on moving forward if Leech's popularity continues, or should we look to maybe stay away from it if that's the case?
I think, honestly, like, Patriot is a deck that I could argue you could play all the time and never. Because at this point, unless Patriot receives a card that is particularly good in it, I don't think the deck will ever be the best one ever again.
Right.
Like, if it's not the best one now, with everything else that's going to happen, it won't, like, magically become the best deck in the game if it doesn't get support. But at the same time, it's been playing the same cards for so long, and it's never fallen out of popularity. So I feel like Patriot is kind of an anomaly in the game where you can't really go wrong playing it, but at the same time, are you exactly right to play it as well?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think this is very much a solved archetype, as you put it. People kind of know what the game plan is, know how to calculate Ultron stats on the final turn of the game, and very much know when to retreat and when to snap with it too, because for the most part, Enchantresses and Rogues on your namesake cards are just retreats. You need to get out of there and leave. But with the current metagame being about developing chunks of points, Patriot can just be very solid for exactly that reason. If you're looking for replacements for this deck or other ways to play it, we actually shared a list last week in the video that was way more greedier, much more combo orientated, based around Sera and Wave and Magic to have much, much higher point ceilings. But at the moment, with the metagame the way that it is, we don't think it's worth taking that risk. You'd much rather take your proactive, safe game plan and not try and keep your key card in hand until turn 6 if possible. So Patriot looking pretty good. From the old into the new, Galactus Knull. Arguably the most Series 5 heavy deck I think we've seen so far, with a whole whopping 2 cards.
If you're playing this, you're rich.
You are, yes. We should call this, Wallet Galactus, something to that effect, maybe. With Knull joining the game, Galactus found a powerful ally he didn't have before. The deck is now way more synergistic than it was previously, and also just much better when it works. Of course, Knull is very new, so it's kind of hard for us to say exactly, the final form of this deck, what it looks like, exactly how good it is. The data is still quite limited in that regard, but it does seem to be an improvement on the previous versions of Galactus and Electro. One of the big evolutions here, again, is Ebony Maw. We're seeing, Lizard, again, all these cards that help us gain priority going into our Galactus turn that we're accelerating into, trying to avoid those arrows and those cosmos stopping us from getting completely shut down. What are we looking to do once the Galactus resolves, though?
Well, once the Galactus resolves, we're looking to, profit. The animation is pretty sick.
It is great, yeah.
And then we're just trying to win the lane. And where I think this build is really good at is that you can win the lane either countering your opponent or just slamming an insane amount of points. And this is where I love Ebony Maw in the deck, to be fair, because with early game like Psylocke, Daredevil, Electro, you're doing things, but at the same time you're looking at Knull and you're like a 6 or an 8. You're not good enough. And then you slot Ebony Maw in the deck and that's my boy. He's an 18 now. We're going places. So I really think Ebony Maw kind of made the finished the sauce. Like, the sauce was really good, and now it's just a great sauce.
Mm.
And also, it also makes other cards really good. For example, like Dr. Octopus was a card that was always like kind of on the verge. It's really good when you Dr. Octopus empty their hand, Galactus another lane, and then they're like, how am I supposed to win a lane with 2 cards? Well, now, how are you supposed to win a lane with 2 cards when Knull actually eats all the power that we just destroyed?
I love to see it. This kind of deck gets me excited. I'm very sad that I don't have the ability to play it myself just yet. It's just something very, very new. Obviously, we haven't seen an archetype like this before, because Galactus is such a unique card that provides such a unique effect, and I'm really kind of hoping that it doesn't stay on the watch list too long if we can help it. One of the interesting inclusions for me in this deck that I didn't necessarily think about to start with, Destroyer, kind of a mainstay of this archetype, obviously playing very well with Knull, and also, of course, Galactus sometimes following it up. Is this a card that we expect to be kind of like a build around of this deck, or is this more just like a tech choice?
It started as a tech choice, and it's more and more becoming a staple because of Knull. Like, once again, like, usually in a deck like this, you would be forced to play Armor or Professor X for Destroyer to work. And now you're just like, yeah, Destroyer, I got Knull, I don't care.
I mean, yeah, makes perfect sense to me.
So it's really weird, but like, Knull is just the card that makes a lot of things click. Like, it allows you to play Ebonima, it allows you to play Destroyer without the usual support, it just makes Lizard even a better 2-cost in the game. It just makes a lot of things click, and Dr. Octopus as well. So maybe the deck will evolve, because right now it's very centered around doing its own thing. Like, arguably there's only Shang-Chi that's really an answer to the current metagame, so maybe a little more like tech cards or things like this will come in the deck later on. But for now, it's just a deck that, honestly, when you draw Knull, you're just like, oh my god, I'm going to end this man's life.
I think it's fair to say that anyone who's playing this deck probably isn't struggling too much with card availability or looking for replacements. But if you are looking for other things you can do, kind of mentioned a few briefly already. Other Destroy effects can be pretty solid here. Make Knull larger, discount death. We kind of talked about Armor and Professor X alongside Destroyer there. The Goblins are quite interesting in this deck. They're obviously very good with Galactus, but very awkward with Knull. You do not want to be destroying a Hobgoblin for that reason. Leader, of course, theoretically slots in everywhere, makes it very hard to lose that one lane after you've done the thing. And even Titania, a card that's being explored in some of these lists if you really want to make it into Wallet Galactus and play all of the big expensive cards instead of a card like Ebony Maw, because you can Galactus her lane if the opponent decides to take her, which is a super sweet little synergy.
Yeah, honestly, like, the first time I tried this, I actually had a ton of fun. Like, you just play Titania early, and then you just don't really care about it, and then the opponent is like, oh, let me take that, and then just Galactus and take it back, and the opponent's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Honestly, like, the first time you do it, you're just like, I'm a freaking genius.
I'm so jealous, and I'm really looking forward to being able to play this deck when I finally get the chance to do so. Hopefully, it continues to evolve and continues to improve in the current metagame. However, from the new back to the old, kind of surprised to see this deck doing so well in myself. Hela Discard making a resurgence up onto the tier list this week. When it comes to developing points without being careful, I guess this is kind of just the king and or queen of doing exactly that. Hela also surprisingly a good counter to Leader unless your opponent's doing the same thing as you.
It's just like, you're giving them 6 points, so like their turn 6 is worth 10. Well, if you discarded any big guy, yours is probably worth 25. We take those.
We certainly do. Certainly a way to build a deck to beat that game plan. Sandman, a super interesting tech choice, making an appearance in this list as well. I'm a big fan of Sandman when Sera is good, and it makes sense that it's also good right now. Very solid against Mr. Negative, very solid against all these Silver Surfer style decks, but definitely a little worse against the rest of the room currently. So definitely a tech choice you can consider, maybe ebboning and flowing based on what you expect to see. The trouble for this deck, however, comes from Cosmo mostly, who can absolutely ruin your Invisible Woman lane and your entire game in the process. If you're not familiar with the game plan of this one, it's really, really simple. We're just looking to discard stuff, but not our Hela, discard all the big things and keep Hela nice and safe, and look to revive it all on that final turn of the game. If people seem to be wanting to get rid of certain tech cards, they're not interested in Sandman, what else should we be looking to include in a deck like this?
Well, the deck is actually quite flexible, because basically any big card that you might want to be summoned with Ella kind of makes sense. But I guess the big thing with the deck is the middle turns, like turn 4 and 5, where you still can be flexible. There are a lot of cards like um, Captain Marvel and these kind of Vision, these kind of cards that will contribute a little less in the points department, but they are making your deck a little bit more flexible. And sometimes, if you feel like you have enough points and you're winning by like 15 or 20 every time, might as well reduce that, win by 10, but be flexible with where you're going to put your points.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think one of the more interesting debates I see around this deck on a somewhat regular basis is the Ghost Rider versus Dracula style argument. Leaning towards Ghost Rider this time, I assume that's just about maximizing points in the late game more than anything else?
Most of the time, yes, especially in the current metagame where you can expect like 2 out of 3 opponents to just play leader. Most of the time, you just build your Ella, play Ella, your opponent was ahead, and suddenly they're not anymore.
Makes a lot of sense.
Like it's on it, like it's really simple, and it might be too simple this way, but honestly, I think if you're picking up the deck, it's a good way to play it for like first 10 to 15 games, and then as time passes, you'll gain flexibility, you'll understand more complicated things. But honestly, at first, this is why the deck is good at. Just your opponent has a medium turn 6, you have an incredible one. That's how you play the deck.
Yeah, if you're looking forward to enjoying incredible turn 6s without worrying about leader, then Hela Discard are very likely the deck for you right now. More of the old guard finding themselves up next. Ongoing Destroyer, kind of nothing really new here, and almost a little bit of a fall from grace in the way that it's kind of descending down the tier list. No new cards to speak of, nothing really changing. Still performing well enough to be a relevant deck, and is definitely much appreciated in the lower ranks where budget alternatives are a thought process when you're looking for decks with no Series 4 or Series 5 cards. Definitely important to note that Destroyer and Spectrum both pretty good against a turn 6 leader though.
That's really, I mean, Destroyer against leader is the first thing I tried when I saw a lot of people talk about leader. I was like, you want my turn 6? All right, I'll take your board. It's stupid, but it just works out. You just have to be a little careful. Just don't play Destroyer onto a Cosmo lane because, well, then it doesn't work. And actually, there aren't that many armors currently. Like, at some point, a lot of people were running armor as a default 2-drop. Now Lizard kind of took that slot, so Destroyer resolves most of the time.
Makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure you don't miss seeing that many armors with this deck. Something that I am missing in this list, however, that I think is super intriguing. No Warpath, which is traditionally a staple in this archetype all around. I think it's very good to see this evolution happening as Aero gets more popular. You really can't guarantee that you're going to have that whole lane clear like you normally would do if your opponent doesn't want you to. Instead, choosing to alleviate cards like Sandman here to kind of make that Red Skull very powerful on turn 5, make sure that your opponent can't play multiple cards, and also slow down all these Silver Surfer decks again.
Yeah, like a really basic play pattern that I found with this deck is just play whatever on 1 and 2, play Cosmo on 3, Sandman on 4, Red Skull on 5, Destroyer behind Cosmo on 6, and it's just difficult to beat that.
There's a lot of stats for a lot of folks to be able to handle. Definitely a reason to play this deck right now, alongside its just normal, traditional, I did the thing kind of games where it can run away with things without the opponent interacting with you all that much. We get a lot of questions about this one, often about cards like Goose and how replaceable they are. The answer, in my opinion at least, is very. I don't think any of the 2-cost ongoing cards are massive staples in the deck. You can choose to play things like Lizard or Mojo if you prefer. You just need them to have ongoing effects for obvious reasons. We used to have Professor X as kind of like a mainstay in this deck, and it's kind of fallen out of favor a little bit, but you could definitely still explore that one alongside a card like Daredevil if you want to synergize around Destroyer a little bit more. Captain America, another card that sees plenty of play in this deck in the past. Most of the time, your opponent doesn't really particularly care about that lane, though. They just focus on the other 2 lanes as a result. And Iron Man serves as a pretty reasonable replacement to Red Skull in this case, as they're mostly included because of Sandman.
Yeah, and a little note on the Professor X, because it's the card that is the most difficult to cut from the deck, because it's just good in the deck and it makes a lot of sense with Destroyer. The big problem with Professor X currently is priority decks will take priority, play Aero, and suddenly your Professor X is like, oh, I didn't win that lane.
Makes sense to see this archetype doing what it can to evolve around Aero's dominance, to be honest.
Yeah, basically, I mean, Ongoing Destroyer is very like established. Like everyone knows what it is, and most people will recognize it quite early. So mainly like the big thing that I was trying to do with this archetype and the ideas that I found and I think were really smart from other players most of the time was try to hide what you're playing as long as possible and try to make it a little awkward for your opponent to punish you. And the biggest punish most of the time was Professor X gets aeroed and you just lost your 5 when they just gained the lane, and suddenly like the game's over. So this is the big one. This is why Professor X is not a stable.
Makes a lot of sense, and yeah, some fantastic insight from yourself there, Den, to kind of clear that up for people that love playing that card and don't know why it isn't seeing as much play anymore. We move on down to tier number 3. Some of the up-and-comers and sometimes underperformers, depending on whether they're going up or down. The first deck in this tier this week, I guess I lied earlier on because there are 3 Series 5 cards in this deck. Bounce Thanos, a new kind of reinvigorated version of the Bounce deck based around Beast and Falcon in the past. No Falcon this time. We're cleaning up space to make space for new play patterns. When the game is all about playing on curve and playing optimal cards, getting all those stats, gaining priorities, Bounce just doesn't care. Plays a very, very different game. The deck doesn't care about priority at all, not in the early game, not in the late game, right up until the point where you have Valkyrie and Shang-Chi on those final turns. So you're going to try and make sure that you don't have priority later on, arguably the other way from everyone else. Also, because you play so many cards, Aero is just kind of weird for the opponent, but it can clog up a lane for you. Kind of makes Valkyrie and Shang-Chi a bit awkward sometimes. Leader and Leech can also be way more of a problem for this archetype. Do we think that's what's keeping it down right now?
No, what's keeping it down, it's holy crap, it's so hard to play like
Yeah,
at
it's so
full
true.
potential. Like it's honestly like I love that Marvel Snap has these kind of decks, because a lot of people, like, I've heard the criticism, a lot of people like kind of stop the game, well, because of the card acquisition system, but also because they're like, 12 cards decks don't give me enough possibilities. Well, try Bounce. Like, you want possibilities, you want a headache, just play this deck.
Yeah, I've tried playing this on stream, and then I stopped shortly afterwards. It's basically impossible to play this thing optimally while trying to interact with chat and manage everything else at the same time. The simple formula to this one really is contest 2 lanes, I guess, if you're looking for the simplest way of kind of breaking it down. Angela, Bishop, Valkyrie, these could potentially steal lanes out of nowhere as well. We can then support that with cheap buffed up units, which usually contribute somewhere between like 6 to 10 extra points. Beast and Carnage going to help you clearing out space that you're going to definitely need to get those stones back out of the way sometimes so you can play them again, keep the ball rolling, draw more cards. And things like Blue Marvel available to kind of buff those gems and make them not completely useless over the course of the game. I think one of my favourite inclusions in your list in particular, again, is Goose. Force the opponent to play by our rules. No expensive cards, just the cheap ones.
Yeah, Goose has won me a lot of games. Also because it makes it safe to just go nuts on Angela and Bishop, because actually these two become Shang-Chi targets a lot of the time with this deck. So you just Goose, and you're like, yeah, nobody's taking that lane ever. Like, I don't think I've ever lost a lane where I go Angela, Bishop, Goose on the same one. Like, no. You can even play Maximus if you want. Angela and Bishop both beat it.
That's incredible stuff. I hadn't even thought about that as a like anti-Shang-Chi card. That's kind of the levels that we're getting to at this point in time, which is really, really crazy. I think the only flexible card I kind of spot here, really, the deck looks a bit tight all in all. Shang-Chi, perhaps, another one that's definitely kind of towards the metagame currently in a deck that we're not looking to play for priority. It makes sense to have it as our anti-meta tool if we need to fit something in to be able to take back turn 5 or take back turn 6.
Yeah, Shang-Chi is just a card that I like a lot currently. Because the metagame is what it is, where people are trying to play one card a turn. And also, I don't know why, if it's the psychological aspect of it, but a lot of people see a lot of small points, and they're like, yeah, I'm safe. And then you're like, Shang-Chi, and we're like, oh, wasn't safe.
Never safe.
Like, sometimes, like, they see 3 stones, and they're like, yeah, I'm never losing this one. And then Shang-Chi comes in and like, yeah, you're losing this one.
You're losing this one. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that's an important thing to point out with this deck as well. For the most part, Thanos is occasionally going to turn up and be an 18 power card, but don't play for it to happen. It's more of an opportunistic thing.
Personal record at 48.
Ooh, very nice. I think mine's only like 32 or something. So,
it was completely stupid. I think I had like I had 3 times the stones, like the Power Stone, and there was Onslaught Citadel on the board. Like, it was just Thanos came in and was like, that's my lane.
That's
like,
rather large.
I felt like the movie Thanos. Like, yeah, the guy in the movie, like, he collapsed and was like, yeah, that lane's mine.
Love to see that. This deck seems like, as I say, mostly rigid. I think the question we're probably going to get with this one a lot of the time, obviously we can't play it without Thanos, it's built around it, but how important are Bast and Valkyrie to this strategy?
Honestly, I could play without Bast. Like, I've been experimenting with Tor instead of Bast as an extra 3-drop, and because the hammer actually has a lot of synergies in the deck, just bounce.
So good.
And sometimes, like, you just go hammer and Valkyrie. Like, it's kind of like, I know you played Valkyrie Control
I did, yes.
a while back. So you just unlock these 0 mana cards and stuff like this, and like the opponent is like, yeah, that lane's empty, and I get like a big card on it, and suddenly you slam 3 cards, and Valkyrie is like, what the hell happened? So Thor is really nice in that regard, and otherwise, like, Shang-Chi is good because it wins us lanes. Like, what we want in this slot is a card that wins this lanes. So Shang-Chi does it because it counters what a lot of people are doing currently, but you have other lane winners that are available, like Devil Dinosaur in this deck. You often finish the game with like 5 to 7 cards, even without really trying. Mystique just has a lot of targets with Blue Marvel. With Goose, I actually won a game because I went Goose into Mystique and the opponent just couldn't play anymore. Most of the time, if you're going to play Mystique, you also want to play Devil Dinosaur, so you want to remove like another card in addition to Shang-Chi. I mean, Mystique on turn 5 and turn 6, sometimes like it's an 8-10 for 3. It's like pretty good. Khazar is a card that I've seen people mention, and every time I try it, it disappoints me. So I put it in, but honestly, it's just, if you're playing on a budget, you play Khazar. If you're not, I don't see where you fit it into 12 cards.
Makes a lot of sense.
And then we have like kind of cards that are really good with Valkyrie, which is Ant-Man, Mojo. Cards that are just super easy to activate with this deck and that actually win the Valkyrie lane. I don't really think they're necessary. I mean, we already have Angela, we already have Bishop, we already have Blue Marvel. So most of the time, I don't feel the need to play such cards. But if you're missing something, I can't fault you for just throwing one of them in there.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Surprising amount of flexibility with this one, and many more ways to kind of build it. It's pretty clear it's still being innovated on and evolved moving forward. So hopefully it can continue climbing its way up, and more people can wrap their head around the nonsense that is Bounce Thanos.
Definitely like the most complicated deck in the game currently. Like, whether playing or building, I honestly think like Bounce it's like my fun place for the tier list, because literally, like, I have no idea what it's going to look like from a week to another. Every time I do research on the deck, I find new stuff.
Love to hear it. That's exactly what keeps me excited about Marble Snap. So, moving on to something a little bit more of a, I guess, tried to innovate and a bit of a failed experiment, unfortunately. Discard Lockjaw. Silver Surfer experiment not going particularly well over here, so we're back to a more traditional list. With no new cards to help the archetype, and arguably Hela having a better play pattern into the current metagame, the only upside of this deck seems to be miffing off Leader, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's really Lockjaw that's whiffing Leader, because if you have priority, which if you buffed Morbius early on with Discard can happen, Leader doesn't copy the cards that come from Lockjaw. He only copies the card you played. Because you play everything behind Lockjaw, you basically played nothing. Leader is a 4/6.
Yeah, definitely a synergy that comes up all the time in many Lockjaw decks to let you kind of cheat Leader from duplicating stuff that you did put into play. Sadly, I don't think there's too much exciting to say about this deck this week. It's kind of moved back to its previous iteration. The game plan is still very simple. You're looking to use Lockjaw to maximize those discard effects. When you start going off, your whole hand is just going to evaporate and be gone before you know it. So that's just means it's pretty important to find either Swarm or Apocalypse before you start going off, or you'll just randomly start discarding things you would much rather keep hold of. Swarm gives you the explosive plays, really good with Lockjaw as well, to kind of give you free fodder to put back into the deck for other things. And Apocalypse, of course, gets very large, making Dracula a win con for a lane all by itself. Great deck. Hopefully it, I guess, finds some new toys soon.
Yeah, I mean, there are cards that have been data mined where discards waiting for it. Like, I don't know if people have seen I think it's Modox,
I think
deck builder. the moment Modox releases into the game, I don't know if it's gonna be good, but I know a lot of people are gonna play Discard.
Yeah, we're certainly going to try and find out. It's definitely an exciting card, so by all means go check that out. But I look forward to seeing if this one can right the ship, because at the moment it's having a bit of a bad time and is definitely the lesser of the two discard decks at this moment in time.
I mean, there was Ellie Courier that was tossed. And I tried it, just doesn't work.
It's not very good. Sorry if you bought it with your tokens, folks, but there you go. However, another Lockjaw deck coming up for us next. Kind of interesting to see this one making, I guess, a little bit of a resurgence, because for ages, On Reveal was the dominant way to play On Reveal. So to see Lockjaw kind of having a comeback is lovely. It's another deck that obviously does very, very well in the face of Leader, and it's aimed at high rolling a ton of points against those decks that are looking for priority. The biggest hurdles for Lockjaw to overcome are definitely Aero and Cosmo. They're going to constantly be annoying for you as you try and develop your game plan. But kind of similar to Hela Discard, this deck is very difficult to beat when it gets the ball rolling, the stars align, you start doing all the things, which might just be the right way to play Snap in the current metagame anyway.
Yeah, and you mentioned Wong Reveal. Like, the reason Wong isn't playable right now is because you play Wong and your opponent is Aero. You don't get to play behind Wong, and then turn 6 they play Magneto, and they're like, oh, Wong moved, and you're just like, why am I playing Wong again? So it is just so bad currently, unfortunately, in the current state of things. So Lockjaw kind of made a little bit of a comeback. It's at the bottom of tier 3 for a reason. It's not incredible. It's not going to be like the metagame like new counter or something like this, but currently it just makes more sense that.
Yeah, definitely the worst week for Wong in quite some time, I think. It's the metagame very hostile, including the cards you previously mentioned, and even just like a reasonable amount of Cosmos still out there, shutting off your play patterns as well. In terms of potential additions for this one, people looking for Lockjaw On Reveal, they don't necessarily have all the big top-end cards. Most of them seem pretty replaceable. You can obviously make them more flexible, more rigid. If you want to play things like Leader, you want to play things like Doctor Doom, that are just better cards if you don't draw Lockjaw. Totally understandable. If you want to support Lockjaw a little bit more, you could even consider playing things like Nightcrawler and Vision that give you more flexibility to move out of the lane, use Lockjaw even more. A synergy that I've been enjoying in the Thanos deck with the Time Stone. Very much the same thing here with Nightcrawler and Vision. The important things to consider when building this deck is very much that you know, how much do you want to edge towards consistency? How much do you just want to try and high roll the other person?
Yeah, and I feel like this is what is needed currently for like tier 3 decks and decks that are literally like a little behind the other ones. Unfortunately, if you were a flexible deck that was able to develop a ton of points, you would be a good deck and you would be competing with everyone else. Because you aren't, you need to like make a statement. Am I going to be a high roll deck? Am I going to be a consistent deck? But you can't do everything. You can do one thing really well, but you got to make a choice.
Yeah, I like that thought process a lot, and I think it's going to help a lot of people with their own deck building in the near future. So definitely one to keep in mind, boys and girls. Last but not least for us this week, the last deck making an appearance in tier number 3, a deck that we haven't seen in quite a while. Cerebro 2 popping its head up here.
Yeah, Cerebro is a weird card because it has always been considered the poor man's Patriot, and with Silver Surfer releasing, it's gone even worse because like, why would I give +2 when I get a new card that gives +3? So it was really tough, but as time passed, two power card actually like gained a lot of traction, and especially we've seen it in other decks, but like cards like Goose or things like this actually are really annoying to people in the current metagame. So Cerebro actually has, it feels, enough cards to be able to annoy people and kind of mitigate the fact that if it goes into a points shootout, it probably is going to lose.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I actually think this deck is one of my personal favorites, just because you have the single best turn 6 into Leader. If you want to play Cerebro and Mystique on turn 6, your opponent is going to achieve not very much shortly after you doing so. Deck's actually pretty easy to play if we're excluding placing our cards on the right spot, which is definitely the most important part of the play patterns with this one. Just develop as many 2 power cards as you can by turn 5, where you're going to be looking to play Blue Marvel at that point, followed by Cerebro and Mystique on turn 6. With that sequence, you're going to end up with a lot of 7 power cards on your side of the field, and hopefully be able to contest both lanes that have 3 or 4 cards on them. The trick with this deck is maximizing our cards that have a chance to annoy the opponent. Make sure you get the most out of Goose, out of Storm, lock them out of locations, make sure they only play where you tell them that you want to play. I actually think this archetype has a lot of room to evolve as well. I've seen a lot of people playing with variations of like Cerebro 2.5 almost, and exploring the ability to still play Valkyrie and Silver Surfer in this deck as the kind of backup plan for when you want to just buff a lane with Cerebro more than everything by giving a buff to dedicated spaces. And I think that's a very interesting spot this deck might evolve going forward. Noticeably, Mr. Sinister not making the cut in this version of the deck. Definitely could in the future, makes a lot of sense as it represents more 2-point bodies and you can play it over something like Invisible Woman if you find that you're missing it or if you find that is more important.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, if you find Brood, you're like, I don't have enough space for Mr. Sinister. But when you don't find Brood, you're like, I wish I had Mr. Sinister. So, up to you.
Yeah, makes a whole lot of sense. There we go. There is your chunk of decks for this week's tier list from tier 1 to tier number 3. As time is passing, Marvel Snap just gaining more and more popularity. The amount of information and opinions to handle when we're creating a tier list like this is increasing a ton as well. Den is under all kinds of strain here, putting in hours and hours of work to put this thing together. This week, the big point of emphasis, all about tech cards, how to include them, while not making the archetype about those cards and acting like they're the foundation of those decks. In the end, the goal with this weekly piece is always going to be to try and inform you about what is coming in Marvel Snap in the future, not just be a newsletter about what Marvel Snap was last week in the face of its last featured location. Is there anything else you want to say on that topic then?
Well, I mean, we had a ton of messages about it, so I guess this is a little bit why I wrote this this outro. And I think like Leech is a great example of how I view the tier list and what I'm trying to accomplish with it. When we do the early releases, we aren't trying to tell you what to play. We are telling you what directions the metagame is taking. And as stated in the intro as well, Marvel Snap is evolving, and although we only have 12 cards available in the deck, I feel like Marvel Snap is going more and more towards like kind of these side decks formats, kind of like Yu-Gi-Oh does it, Magic does it, where you actually are playing with 12, but you really are thinking about 15, 16 cards, and you're just going to switch 3 or 4 cards based on what you want to do, the metagame, what you want to counters, and things like this. So I think this is why it's really important to work with reasonings more than with cards currently, because if you have a solid reasoning, you're going to be able to explain a lot of cards. While if you have a lot of cards, but you don't know what to do with it, well, you're just going to think like it just does nothing and it's completely worthless and the deck is bad. So yeah, this week I really focused around like reasonings. And yes, it means that some of the lists aren't what you might be facing on the ladder, but the idea behind the deck is the exact same. And if the metagame changes and you understood the idea behind the deck, you're going to be able to adapt. Well, if you just think about, oh my god, everybody plays Leech, when we're going to start countering Leech, you're going to be focused on that idea and it's going to cost you a ton of cubes.
Makes a lot of sense. I think it's definitely a very valid deck building kind of philosophy for people to take going forward in the future. We're not ever going to try and... We don't think it's our place to try and tell you, you know, what to play or how to play it or not. It's going to depend on your experience and what you enjoy about Marvel Snap and, you know, your own understanding of the game. We're only ever going to be 2 guys on the internet giving you, you know, our interpretation of data and opinion. And that's true for most decks in this article. Nothing is set in stone. You know, card games evolve over time constantly, especially evolving absolutely tons with more and more people play the game when it takes us so long to put content like this together. So we're hoping in the near future that our tracker, which of course many people have hopped onto, offering great data and is slowly evolving and getting better and better, can help provide us with a more clear picture in the future to be able to back up our thoughts and feelings as that continues to evolve, and we look forward to making sure that's the case. However, nonetheless, hopefully this video and article this week were very helpful to you in some way, and it might help you understand the current environment, metagame, and kind of the deck building thought process a little bit more. As usual, if you want to reach out for any feedback, you can leave a comment in the comment section down below for us. You can come and find us over on Twitter at Marvel Snap Zone. Alternatively, if you want to reach out to us in the community Discord, you can do that too. There's over 5,000 members in there now, chatting 24 hours a day about everything everything Marble Snap. Alternatively, if you want to find me, you want to come and talk Marble Snap with me, I'm at HowlingMines on every platform under the sun. Den, if people want to find you, where can they find you?
What I check most is Twitter at den_CCG. Otherwise, you can tag me in the community Discord. Like, unfortunately, I can't just read every channel all the time because this thing is super active and I just can't keep up. But I mean, every time you just mention HowlingMines or myself, we usually tend to answer in the hour. So feel free to use that possibility. And yeah, these are basically the two places that I check daily.
Makes perfect sense, and hopefully some people will reach out and have a chat with you about their opinions going forward instead of just blasting us on Twitter. Until next time, folks, I have been HowlingMines, you have been amazing, and this has been Marble Snap Zone. Take care, have a good one.